The silent cry of a desperate sun. The sun cast a dull, oppressive light over the narrow streets where 7-year-old Jalil lived. The boy's world was small, defined by cracked sidewalks where he dribbled a scuffed basketball, and the modest one-bedroom apartment he shared with his mother, Amara. She was everything to him, his protector, his teacher, his safe place in a world that often felt too big, too loud, and too cruel. Amara worked long hours at a small, dimly lit diner on the corner of their neighborhood. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional second-hand book she brought home for Jalil. But despite the exhaustion that lined her face, she never let her son see her break. She was his lighthouse, steady and bright, no matter how fierce the storms that raged around them. Jalil knew she carried burdens he could not understand. He saw it in the way she counted change before buying food, in the way she paused before answering his questions about why some people looked at them differently when they walked through certain parts of town. But she never let him feel small. Every night, before she tucked him into bed, she told him stories. Stories about warriors who fought against impossible odds, about kind-hearted princes who saved kingdoms, not with swords but with wisdom. "You're stronger than you know, my love," she would whisper as she ran her fingers through his short, tightly coiled hair. "And when the time comes, you will do what must be done." At the time, Jalil thought she was just trying to help him sleep. He never imagined those words would become a prophecy. The sting of fate. It happened on a rare afternoon when Amara had a day off. She stood by the kitchen window, humming softly as she tended to the small potted plants she had nurtured for years. The green leaves stretched toward the light, reaching like they, too, longed for something just out of grasp. Jalil sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through one of his old books, when a sharp gasp broke the rhythm of the day. "Ah!" Amara clutched her arm, her face twisting in pain. Jalil scrambled to his feet, his small hands hovering near hers. "Mama, what happened?" She exhaled sharply and shook her head. "Just a bee sting, baby. Nothing to worry about." But within minutes her breathing changed. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, and her skin, usually warm and deep brown, turned an unnatural shade of red. She staggered, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Mama." Jalil's voice was small, frightened. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her knees buckled. She crashed to the floor. Panic seized him. He had never seen his mother like this before. She was always strong, always in control. Now she looked like she was drowning in the air itself. Jalil's hands trembled as he grabbed the old rotary phone from the wall and dialed 911 the way his mother had taught him to do in emergencies. His voice cracked as he gave their address. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line, but he barely heard them. His focus was on Amara, on the way her breath was becoming shallower by the second. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Mama, wake up, please." Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. The ambulance took forever. At least, that's what it felt like to Jalil. He held her hand, whispering all the bedtime stories she had ever told him, hoping the words would keep her tethered to him. By the time the paramedics arrived and rushed her to the hospital, Jalil's heart was pounding so hard it hurt. He rode in the back of the ambulance, holding her limp hand the entire way. A bitter goodbye. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something else, something cold, something sterile. The nurses moved quickly, speaking in hushed voices, pushing Jalil to the waiting area while they wheeled his mother away. A woman in blue scrubs knelt in front of him. "We'll do everything we can, sweetheart." He didn't answer. He just stared at the double doors that had swallowed his mother. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then two. Finally, a doctor appeared. His face was blank, his eyes unreadable. "I'm so sorry." Jalil barely registered the rest of what the man said. Something about an allergic reaction, about how it had progressed too quickly, how they had done all they could. His mother was gone. Just like that. The world blurred. The doctor was still talking, but the words dissolved into meaningless noise. The hospital walls felt too tight, like they were pressing in on him, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But instead, he stood there, frozen, his small hands curled into fists, a heart too young to break. The days after Amara's death were a haze. The world continued as if nothing had changed, but for Jalil, everything had. He was sent to live with a distant relative, an aunt he barely knew. She tried to be kind, but she wasn't his mother. She didn't know how to tuck him in the right way or how to make tea just the way Amara did. She didn't tell him bedtime stories. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that day over and over. He thought about how the hospital had taken her away, how they had shaken their heads and said, "There was nothing we could do." But that wasn't true. Jalil didn't understand much about hospitals, but he understood this. People were supposed to help. Doctors were supposed to save lives, but they had let his mother die. Anger took root in his chest, deep and bitter. He didn't cry. Crying wouldn't bring her back. Instead, he thought about the stories she used to tell, about warriors who fought for what they loved. And then he remembered something else, something he had once overheard on the playground from a boy who swore his cousin had seen it happen. "There are people who know how to bring the dead back," the boy had whispered, his eyes wide with the weight of his own words. "But it's dangerous, and you gotta find the right stuff." Jalil didn't know if it was true, but he had nothing left to lose. The plan begins. For days, he listened. He paid attention to the way people whispered in the back alleys, the way old men at the corner store talked about forgotten remedies and ancient secrets. He knew the morgue was beneath the hospital, a cold place where bodies rested before they were buried. And then, one night, he heard something that made his pulse race. A man with sunken eyes and a raspy voice spoke to another outside a liquor store. "There's a guy, a healer, deals in the old ways. They say he can wake the dead." Jalil's heart pounded. He followed the man, staying in the shadows. If there was even the slightest chance of bringing his mother back, he would take it, no matter what it cost. A boy with nothing left to lose. The city was filled with whispers, with forgotten magic hiding in plain sight. Jalil didn't know what kind of world he was stepping into, but he didn't care. His mother had been taken from him, and he was going to bring her back, even if it meant sneaking into the morgue under the cover of darkness, even if it meant defying the laws of life and death itself. Because love, true, desperate, unwavering love, was stronger than any rule, and he refused to say goodbye. The path of shadows. The night was thick with silence, a heavy kind that pressed against the world, making everything feel smaller, suffocating. Jalil sat on the edge of his borrowed bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of his aunt's apartment. The sheets smelled different. The air felt different. Everything was wrong. He hadn't cried. Not once. Tears wouldn't fix this. Tears wouldn't bring her back. He replayed the whispers he had overheard, about the healer, the old ways, the things people didn't speak of unless they were desperate. Jalil had never been more desperate in his life. A deal in the dark. The man was easy to find once Jalil knew where to look. The people in his neighborhood didn't talk about him loudly, but they knew he was there, lurking in the edges of forgotten places, dealing in things no one else dared to touch. Jalil followed the rumors to an old, crumbling house at the end of an alley where the streetlights didn't reach. The windows were covered in grime, the door barely hanging onto its hinges. He knocked once, twice. Silence. Then the door creaked open. A man stood there, tall and thin, his skin like old leather, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He looked at Jalil the way a wolf looks at a wounded rabbit. "You lost, boy." Jalil shook his head. "I need help." The man sniffed the air, as if testing for lies. "Help with what?" Jalil's fists clenched. "Bringing someone back." For a long moment, the man didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the house smelled of earth and something bitter, like dried herbs left too long in the sun. Candles flickered on shelves lined with strange objects, bones, jars filled with dark liquids, bundles of dried flowers tied with twine. The man sat down in a wooden chair that groaned under his weight. "Who told you about me?" Jalil swallowed. "No one. I just listened." A small smirk tugged at the corner of the man's lips. "Smart boy." Jalil didn't care about being smart. He cared about one thing. "Can you do it?" The man leaned forward, the candlelight casting deep shadows across his face. "That depends." Jalil frowned. "On what?" "On how far you're willing to go. The price of miracles." Jalil had never believed in magic. Not really. He had believed in stories, in the strength of warriors, in the kindness of heroes. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was real. The man reached under the table and pulled out a small glass vial. The liquid inside was thick, dark, almost black in the dim light. It shimmered as he turned it in his fingers. "This," he said, "is what you're looking for." Jalil's breath caught. "How does it work?" The man's expression darkened. "It's not a gift. It's not a miracle. It's a bargain." Jalil's hands curled into fists. "What do you mean?" The man leaned back, tapping the vial with a long, bony finger. "The dead don't come back without cost. Something must be given in return." Jalil's heart pounded. "Like what?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid the vial across the table. "You want her back. You take this, pour it into her mouth before the sun rises. But be warned, boy, what comes back may not be the same as what was lost." Jalil's fingers trembled as he reached for the vial. "I don't care," he whispered. The man's gaze was heavy, almost pitying. "You will." Into the depths. Jalil ran. The city blurred around him, the streets twisting in the dim light. He clutched the vial to his chest, the glass cold against his skin. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows glowing a sterile white. The morgue was underneath, a place where the dead were kept before they were laid to rest. He had listened, learned, watched the workers as they took out the trash or stepped outside for a cigarette. There was a door near the back, one that was sometimes left unlocked. Tonight, luck was on his side. Jalil slipped inside, his breath coming in sharp, quick gasps. The air was frigid, thick with the scent of chemicals, and something deeper, something still, something empty. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one holding a body waiting to be buried or claimed. He knew which one was his mother's. He had memorized the number. With shaking hands, he reached for the handle. The drawer slid open with a low, metallic groan. And there she was, Amara, still, silent. Her face was peaceful, but it wasn't right. It wasn't her. Jalil bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. This wasn't real. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He uncorked the vial, his hand steady now. He had come too far to stop. The liquid inside smelled of earth, of rain, of something ancient. Carefully, he tilted the vial against her lips, letting the dark substance slip past. Nothing happened. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a breath. Sharp, sudden. Jalil stumbled back as his mother's chest rose violently, her eyes flying open, wide and unseeing. Her body convulsed. And then, she sat up, a mother reborn. For a moment, Jalil couldn't breathe. His mother blinked, her eyes darting around the room, confusion twisting her features. Her skin was still cold, her movements slow, unnatural. Then she turned to him. "Jalil." His heart nearly stopped. "Mama." He threw himself at her, wrapping his arms around her. She was real. She was here. But something was wrong. Her hands were too cold, her breath too slow, her voice different. She pulled back slightly, her gaze locking onto his, and for the first time, Jalil felt fear. Her eyes, once warm, full of love, were empty. Something had come back. But was it really her? A mother's hollow eyes. Jalil's breath hitched in his throat. His mother, his beautiful, strong, kind-hearted mother, was staring at him, but something in her eyes was wrong. They were open, wide but empty, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. Her pupils, once warm and deep brown, had turned an eerie shade of black, swallowing the light in the room. "Mama." His voice was small, shaking. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. Her lips parted, and her breath came in raspy gasps, as though she had forgotten how to breathe. "Jalil." Her voice was low, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. She was speaking. That was good, right? Tears welled in his eyes as he grabbed her cold hands. "Mama, it's me. I brought you back. I didn't want to lose you." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, her fingers twitched, wrapping slowly around his. Jalil felt a rush of relief. It worked. It actually worked. But then, her grip tightened. Too tight. Pain shot through his fingers, sharp and unrelenting. "Mama," he gasped, trying to pull away. She didn't let go. Her head tilted slightly, her gaze locking onto him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. His mother had always been warm, gentle. This thing, this woman, looked like her, sounded like her, but something deep in Jalil's bones screamed that this was not his mother. "Jalil," her voice came again, this time softer, almost affectionate. "You brought me back." He swallowed hard. "Yes, Mama. I." She leaned closer, her breath cold against his cheek. "Why?" The question made him freeze. Why? Because he loved her. Because she was his whole world. Because he couldn't bear to be alone. But the way she asked it, there was no warmth, no joy, no relief. Only curiosity. Something was wrong. The air in the morgue had changed, thick and suffocating. The dim lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows against the walls. Jalil forced himself to stay calm. Maybe she was just confused. Maybe she needed time. "I had to, Mama," he whispered. "You were gone. They didn't help you. I had to do something." She blinked slowly, tilting her head again, studying him like he was something foreign, something unfamiliar. Then, her grip loosened. Jalil pulled his hands back, rubbing them where her fingers had dug into his skin. For the first time, his mother smiled. But it wasn't the smile he remembered. It was too slow, too calculated. And her teeth, had they always been that sharp? Jalil shuddered. Something was very, very wrong. The thing that wore his mother's face. The room felt colder than before. The air itself seemed to hum with something unnatural, something ancient. Jalil tried to steady his breathing. "Mama, we have to go. We can't stay here." She blinked again, as if processing his words. Then, slowly, she swung her legs over the edge of the metal table. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Jalil felt his stomach twist into knots. Had he made a mistake? No. This was his mother. It had to be. But why did she feel wrong? She stood, her feet touching the cold tile floor. Her fingers twitched at her sides as she took her first unsteady step forward, and then another. Her breathing was still off. Not natural. Too slow. Too forced. Jalil's heart pounded as he grabbed her hand. It was ice cold, but he held on. "Come on, Mama. We have to go before someone finds us." She said nothing, just followed. He led her out of the morgue, moving quickly through the dimly lit corridors. The hospital was quiet at this hour, only a few nurses and security guards roaming the halls. If they saw them, if they realized what he had done. No, he couldn't let that happen. He tightened his grip on her hand and pulled her toward the exit. They slipped outside into the night. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long, stretching shadows on the streets. Jalil's aunt's apartment wasn't far. He just had to get her home. Then everything would be okay. Right? A mother's hunger. The walk home was quiet, too quiet. His mother moved beside him, her footsteps eerily light, as if she wasn't entirely touching the ground. Jalil tried to ignore the way the streetlights flickered as they passed, the way stray dogs in the alleyways whined and backed away when they saw her. He tried to ignore the way her fingers twitched every now and then, as if remembering how to move. He tried to ignore the way her breathing was still wrong. By the time they reached the apartment, Jalil's hands were trembling. He opened the door and pulled her inside. The apartment was small, just a couch, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom. Jalil let go of her hand. "You can rest now, Mama." She said nothing, just stood there, watching him. Jalil swallowed hard. I'll get you some tea, okay? Like you used to make for me." She tilted her head, as if trying to remember. Then she smiled again. That same, too slow, too sharp smile. Jalil hurried to the kitchen, gripping the counter to steady himself. His hands were shaking. This was wrong. Something was wrong. A noise behind him made him freeze. A slow, wet sound, like chewing. Like something soft being torn apart. Jalil turned around slowly, and his blood ran cold. His mother stood in the middle of the living room. Her hands, her beautiful, strong hands, were covered in blood. Her mouth, oh God, her mouth, was full of something dark and raw. And at her feet, a stray cat, its body limp, torn apart. Jalil's breath caught in his throat. His mother turned to him. Her black eyes gleamed in the dim light. She licked her lips. "Jalil," she whispered, stepping forward. Her voice was warm now, gentle, almost affectionate. But her smile was hungry. Jalil stumbled back. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. This wasn't his mother. It wasn't her anymore. And he had brought it back. The monster in my mother's skin. Jalil couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his heart slamming against his ribs as he stared at the thing wearing his mother's face. The dim light from the kitchen cast eerie shadows across her features. She was still beautiful, still the woman he had loved more than anything. But the darkness in her eyes, the way she moved, slow, deliberate, unnatural, sent ice through his veins. The dead cat lay in a mess of dark fur and crimson. Its body was torn, shredded as though something had ripped into it with teeth too sharp to belong to a human. The metallic scent of blood filled the small apartment, thick and suffocating. Jalil tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. His mother wiped her mouth slowly, dragging the back of her hand across her lips. A smear of blood remained, and she didn't seem to care. She smiled at him. That slow, deliberate smile. "My love," she whispered. Her voice was soft now, familiar. The voice of his mother. And yet it wasn't. Jalil's stomach twisted. Mama." His voice cracked. She took a step toward him, her bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I'm here now." But that was the problem. She was here. She wasn't supposed to be. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The man with the sunken eyes, the one who had given him the vial. What comes back may not be the same as what was lost. Jalil's breath shuddered. He had thought he could handle it. He had been willing to pay any price to bring her back. But now, standing in front of the thing that had returned, he realized something terrible. He had no idea what he had brought into this world. A hollow embrace. His mother, or what had been his mother, reached out a hand. "Come here, baby." Jalil flinched. He had never flinched from her before. Her hand froze in midair, as if sensing his hesitation. Her fingers twitched slightly. Then she smiled again. "It's all right," she said, her voice smooth, reassuring. You did the right thing. Jalil wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe he hadn't made a horrible mistake. But then, her stomach growled. Not a normal growl. A deep, unnatural sound that sent a chill slithering down his spine. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. Then she exhaled, slow, controlled, as if trying to calm something inside her. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time since she had come back, Jalil saw something human in her expression. Pain. She hesitated, pressing a hand against her chest. I feel empty. Her gaze flickered to the cat's remains. Jalil's stomach turned. Empty. Hungry. Not human. Mama, he whispered, stepping back. You just ate that cat. She looked down at her blood-stained hands. Her lips parted slightly, as if the realization had only just dawned on her. I didn't mean to. But her voice was distant, hollow, like she wasn't sure if she was telling the truth. Jalil felt a sob rising in his throat. He shook his head, willing the tears not to come. He had wanted his mother back. He had fought for her, stolen for her, risked everything for her. But this wasn't what he had wanted. This wasn't her. The truth behind the magic. A sudden thought slammed into him. The man, the one who had given him the vial. He knew. He had warned Jalil, hadn't he? What comes back may not be the same. Jalil clenched his fists. He had to go back. Had to find the man. Had to fix this. He took a shaky step backward. Mama, I need to go to the store. I'll be right back, okay? Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and knowing. Stay, she murmured. It wasn't a request. Jalil's blood ran cold. Her fingers twitched again, and something shifted in her expression. Something primal, something hungry. He took another step back. Her body tensed. His heart pounded. Then, suddenly, she lunged. Jalil yelped, darting to the side just as her hands grabbed for him. He hit the floor hard, his ribs slamming against the wood. He scrambled back, wide-eyed. Mama, stop. She crouched now, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her black eyes glinting in the dim light. Then, she smiled. Not his mother's smile. A predator's smile. His stomach twisted with terror. This was not his mother. This was something else. A desperate escape. Jalil bolted. He ran for the door, his hand shaking so badly he could barely grasp the knob. But before he could turn it, a hand slammed against the wood beside his head. Cold fingers, unnaturally strong. His breath hitched as he turned his head slowly. His mother, the thing that had been his mother, stood inches away. Too close. Too fast. She had moved too fast. Her face was still eerily calm, but her eyes, those awful, empty black eyes, bore into him. Where are you going, baby? She murmured. Jalil couldn't breathe. His hands trembled against the doorknob. She leaned closer, her breath icy against his skin. You brought me back, she whispered, her voice laced with something twisted, something almost amused. And now you want to leave. Jalil forced himself to swallow the scream clawing at his throat. Think. The man. The one who had given him the vial. He was the only one who could fix this. But first, he had to get out. His eyes darted to the small window beside the kitchen. It was a tight squeeze, but it was his only chance. With a burst of adrenaline, he ducked under his mother's outstretched arm and sprinted for the window. Behind him, a snarl. Not human. Not even clothes. Jalil jumped. Glass shattered around him as he crashed through the window, his arms and legs burning with fresh cuts. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto the pavement. For a split second, he was too stunned to move. Then, a loud thud. He turned just in time to see her, his mother, the thing that wore his mother's face, crawling through the broken window. Too fast. Too unnatural. Her body twisted in ways it shouldn't. Jalal's breath caught. She looked at him and smiled. He ran, as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't look back, didn't dare, because he knew she was following him. The hunt in the dark. Jalal ran. The city blurred around him, the cold night air burning his lungs. His feet pounded against the cracked pavement, his pulse roaring in his ears. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't, because he knew she was following him, not running, gliding. He could hear her, the thing that had once been his mother, the way her bare feet barely touched the ground, the way her breath came too slow, too controlled, as if she wasn't even winded. Jalal's body screamed for rest, but he pushed forward. He had to find the man, the one who had given him the vial. He had to fix this. But the streets stretched endlessly before him, dark and unfamiliar. His aunt's neighborhood was gone now, replaced by old warehouses and abandoned lots. This part of the city felt empty, forgotten, just like the thing chasing him. A sharp sound sliced through the silence. A laugh. Soft, lilting, almost affectionate. Jalal's breath caught in his throat. She was playing with him. A fresh jolt of terror surged through him. He veered left, diving into a narrow alleyway littered with broken bottles and discarded trash. He pressed himself against the cold brick wall, chest heaving. Silence. Had he lost her? He swallowed hard, trying to calm his breathing. Think, Jalal, think. Then, a whisper. You always loved hide and seek, didn't you? His blood turned to ice. She was here. He flattened himself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The alley stretched into shadows, too dark to see clearly. But he could feel her. Somewhere, close, watching, waiting. A shiver ran down his spine. Then, a single step. Soft, slow, deliberate. Jalal clenched his fists. His legs trembled. If she found him, no, he had to keep moving. He turned on his heel, dashing toward the end of the alley. He could see the main street ahead. If he could just. Something grabbed his ankle. A hand. Cold. Unrelenting. Jalal screamed as he was yanked backward. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs. His vision blurred, but he could still see her. She was crouched in the alley, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her black eyes gleaming in the darkness. Her smile was too wide, too knowing. She ran a blood-stained hand over his cheek. "My baby," she murmured. "Why are you running?" Jalal's stomach twisted. He tried to shove her away, but she didn't move. She was too strong. Her fingers curled around his wrist, pulling him closer. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered. "I would never hurt you." Lies. The dead don't come back without a price. He struggled, thrashing against her grip. "Mama, please." Her eyes darkened. For a split second, something flashed across her face. Something human. Pain. Confusion. Then, hunger. Her grip tightened. Her lips parted, revealing teeth that looked sharper than before. She was going to devour him. The man who knew too much. A sharp whistle sliced through the air. Jalal flinched. His mother's head snapped toward the sound, her expression twisting into something almost angry. Then, a voice. Deep, calm, unshaken. "You weren't supposed to wake up yet." Jalal turned toward the mouth of the alley. And there he was, the man with sunken eyes. His coat was the same, tattered, covered in strange symbols. He stood with one hand in his pocket, the other holding a small dark pouch. His gaze flickered to Jalal. "Told you, boy. What comes back ain't always what was lost." Jalal's chest heaved. "Fix it," he gasped. "You have to fix it." The man exhaled slowly. "It ain't that simple." His mother, or the thing that wore her skin, rose to her feet. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her black eyes narrowed. "This is mine," she hissed. "He brought me back. He belongs to me." The man shook his head. "No, sweetheart, you don't belong here." Jalil felt his stomach drop. His mother growled. A deep guttural sound, more animal than human. And then she moved. Too fast. One moment she was standing still. The next, she was lunging. The man barely flinched. With a practiced motion, he threw the contents of the pouch into the air. A dark, powdery substance swirled around them, catching in the wind. It smelled of something old, something rotten. Jalil gagged. His mother staggered. For the first time since she came back, she faltered. She clutched her head, her mouth twisting into a silent scream. The man took a slow step forward. His voice was soft now, almost gentle. "Go back, darling. This ain't your world anymore." Jalil watched in horror as his mother's body shuddered. Her skin cracked. Not like a wound. Like porcelain breaking. "No." Jalil surged forward. "Stop." But the man held up a hand. "It ain't her, boy. Not anymore." Jalil's heart broke. His mother turned to him, her black eyes flickering, just for a second, with something real, something human. She reached for him. "Jalil." Her voice was barely a whisper. Then, she crumbled. Her body collapsed into ashes. The wind carried them away. Jalil stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where his mother had been. Gone. Again. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. A hand rested on his shoulder. The man's voice was quiet. "Time to go home, kid." Jalil clenched his fists. "No." The man raised an eyebrow. "I want to know why," Jalil said, his voice shaking. "I want to know what she became. What you did. Everything." The man studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "All right," he said. "Let's talk." The price of playing God. Jalil stood in the alley, his chest rising and falling in sharp gasps. His mother, or whatever had come back in her place, was gone. The wind had carried her away like dust, as if she had never existed at all. But she had. She had existed. She had been warm and real. She had held him when he cried. She had kissed his forehead every night and told him stories about warriors and kings. And now, she was nothing but ashes. His hands trembled. He looked down at them, half expecting to see her blood. Her blood, not that thing's. But they were clean. His chest ached. It wasn't fair. The man, the one with sunken eyes and a face carved with knowledge far older than he should have possessed, stood beside him, watching quietly. Jalil turned to him, fists clenching at his sides. "You knew," he rasped, his voice thick with grief. The man exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. "I warned you." Jalil's rage flared. "You knew what was going to happen. You knew she wasn't really coming back." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "I knew something would come back," he admitted, "but not all things return the way they left." Jalil's fingers twitched. He wanted to hit him, to scream, to do something. Instead, he took a shuddering breath. "I want to know everything." The man's brows lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected that response. Jalil lifted his chin. "You said you'd tell me. So tell me." A slow smile tugged at the man's lips. He studied Jalil for a moment, as if deciding whether he was worth the truth. Then he sighed. "All right, kid." He turned and started walking. Jalil hesitated. Then, with one last glance at the spot where his mother had disappeared, he followed. The keeper of forgotten things. They walked in silence through the empty streets. The city loomed around them, vast and dark, but Jalil barely noticed. His thoughts were a storm. What had he done? What had he really brought back? The man led him to a part of the city Jalil had never seen before. The buildings here were old, forgotten, covered in ivy and graffiti. There were no streetlights, no cars, just a long, winding path that led to a crumbling house at the very edge of the world. The man pushed open the rusted door. Inside, the air was heavy. Not thick with dust, but with something older. Candles lined the shelves. Strange artifacts sat on wooden tables, bones, dried herbs, old books with symbols Jalil didn't recognize. The man moved through the room with ease, setting his coat on a chair before sitting down. "Sit," he said. Jalil didn't want to. He wanted to demand answers, to make the man explain himself. But his legs were weak, his body was exhausted. So he sat. The man steepled his fingers. "Tell me, boy, what do you think life is?" Jalil frowned. "What?" The man tilted his head. "You heard me." Jalil hesitated. It's being alive. Breathing. Thinking." The man smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Wrong." Jalil's stomach twisted. The man leaned forward. "Life isn't just breath. It's a balance, a thread woven into everything. You cut that thread. It doesn't go back the way it was. Not really." Jalil's hands curled into fists. "Then why did you give me the vial? If you knew she wouldn't be the same." The man shrugged. "Because I was curious." Jalil froze. His pulse roared in his ears. Curious. This had been an experiment to him. Jalil shot to his feet. "You used me." The man didn't deny it. "You played with her life." Jalil's voice cracked. "With mine." The man studied him. Then he sighed. "You think you were the first," he said quietly. Jalil's breath stilled. The man gestured toward the shelves, toward the books, the bones, the jars. "People have been trying to bring back the dead for centuries, kid. They never like what comes back." Jalil's mind reeled. His mother. Asterisk, asterisk, the thing she became. Asterisk, asterisk, hadn't been the first. But then, has anyone ever done it right? Jalil asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's expression darkened. "No," he said simply, "and I don't think anyone ever will." Jalil's stomach twisted. So this had all been for nothing. His mother was gone. And she was never coming back. The truth behind the dead. Jalil sat back down, numb. The man watched him. Then, after a moment, he leaned forward. "Do you want to know what she became?" Jalil flinched. He didn't. Not really. But he had to. He nodded. The man exhaled. "What you brought back, it wasn't her. Not fully. It was a shell, a memory, a thing pulled from between life and death." Jalil swallowed. "So it was a demon." The man shook his head. "No, not a demon. Just something lost." Jalil's hands trembled. Lost. That was almost worse. He had trapped her. Between life and death. Between who she had been and what she had become. He had done that to her. The grief hit him like a wave. He bent forward, burying his face in his hands. His body shook with silent sobs. The man didn't comfort him. He just let him break. After what felt like an eternity, Jalil lifted his head. His eyes burned, his heart a hollow shell. He looked at the man. "What do I do now?" The man sighed. "That's up to you, kid." Jalil stared at him. The man had given him the vial. Had used him for curiosity. But he had also ended it. And now Jalil was alone. For real this time. He swallowed the pain down. "I want to learn." The man's brows lifted slightly. "Learn?" Jalil nodded, wiping his face. "I want to know what you know." The man studied him. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. Not cruel, not amused, just knowing. "All right," he murmured. "Let's begin." And with that, Jalil took his first step into a world he could never leave. the world of the dead, and the ones who bring them back.